Okay. Hello, everyone, and good evening, everyone who's online. I must say this is quite intimidating doing this for the first time. I thought I was a bit of a techno geek, but it was the first time for everything. So let's see how it goes. 1974 was a long time ago. Richard Nixon was still president when I started this trip. He wasn't when I finished it. I think Edward Heath was about to be replaced by Maggie Thatcher, just to give it a bit of context. And when I got back to South Africa, everybody was so excited about watching the test pattern on the TV. After 3 years of BBC. And they wondered why I wasn't impressed. But how did it all come about? Well, I'd spent 72 to 74 hiking as much as I could, but obviously having to work in between for a living. In those days, you could buy a pound for R2. And in Europe, you could, with hitchhiking and staying in youth hostels, you could live on R1.50 a day. So it was a little easier than it is now. However, we also had to do things like making our own backpacks, which you can see there because you couldn't get A-frames here, or if you could, you couldn't afford it anyway. So we made the first ones as students in Natal. How do I do that? Oh, there. Okay, that's better. Yeah. So life was very free and easy in those days. Most of my friends were hiking friends from university days. And of course, like most young South Africans, we migrated back to the old country for a couple of years. And pubs were very convenient places to meet. And this particular meeting was with a lot of my friends who'd been climbing Mount Kenya. They were much more mountaineers than I was. We met in this pub on the Thames. The picture on the left is of the pub where we actually met, the Old Caledonian, but that's subsequently apparently burnt down, and there is a new one there. But as you can see, very close to Big Ben. And it was a reunion of these friends who climbed Mount Kenya, where there was one guy who'd been a vet in Kenya, and he climbed Mount Kenya with them. So he was there too. And he'd been on furlough for a couple of months, and he bought his mother, or wanted to buy his mother, a new Renault 4 car, Channel Islands model, because she lived on the Isle of Wight. And he'd had one for 10 years. And as a trade-in, he was only offered £100. So Jim, as his name was, said, as a chance remark, £100, that's an insult. You know, this car's never been off the Isle of Wight. Worth more than that. Guy said, £100, take it or leave it. He said, I've got a jolly good mind to drive it out to Kenya. And I happened to be sitting next to him, and I said, you want to drive it out to Kenya? Great, let's go. So we did. So I packed up my job. That was the card that my company that I was working for gave me. That's how they envisaged me. And we did a bit of stocking up. Obviously, we needed the odd visa, a carnet de passage, which is like a passport for a car, AA membership, not that we ever used it, not much AA in Africa, bit of insurance, a boots medical kit. I think I've still got the little bandages today in my hiking medical kit. 60 meters of rope, tools, a spade, 2 short scaffolding planks, tent, 2 stretchers. And then we added to the car a roof rack. We bought 4 polythene containers, 2 mud grip tires, second-hand spares, a small winch, which was mounted on the front, a meter of T-bar iron from a dump, a bit of spare oil and brake fluid. We raised the suspension, bought some puncture repair kits and a foot pump. All of that cost £190, which is what, 380 Rand, as it was in those days. And personally, I thought I'd better have a camera. So I went out and bought the first second-hand camera that I could buy, which was a Russian one, which was a Zorki. There was obviously nothing digital in those days, just a choice between photographs and slides. And I opted for slides. And the pictures that you see today are what I've digitized from those slides, with possibly some questionable quality here and there. But it's amazing what digitization can do. To psych myself up, I read a book, and this is the one that I could find. Geoffrey Morehouse's The Fearful Void. And it was the story of him traveling from east to west across the Sahara, from west to east on a camel. And it was as much about his mental state as it was about what he encountered on his trip. And this was very significant for me. And he called his version of the Sahara the Fearful Void. And it was about how he had to overcome his fears. So having read this, I figured that I was not going to get to Cape Town if I was fearful of anything. And hence the title of my talk, which is The Fearless Void. Thank you, Geoffrey. I did a little bit of research when I was putting the slideshow together a while ago, because I wanted to know when Renault Fords first came onto the market. I remember fellow students in the late 1960s had the odd one on the Maritzburg campus. And eventually I found a couple of things. And I just want to read you some of these parts because they're quite relevant to what happened later. So first of all, there is beginning to appear on our roads a rather queer-looking, lofty, small saloon, reminiscent of those illustrations labeled a motor car in the less meticulous children's books, and bearing the Renault badge. This is the Renault 4L, a fascinating new vehicle for farmers and other non-snobs. Yes. In this clever Renault 4L, then, you have the simple car par excellence. Torsion bars suspend the vehicle so that there is some 23 centimeters of movement, not that far, which renders the 4L impervious to unmade surfaces and rutted lanes. Why are we not all driving them in South Africa at the moment? I don't know. And then even more significantly, the heater unit is a huge stove. Indeed, once the hot water has been turned on, this very efficient stove requires some time to cool after it has been turned off, and vice versa. But no one need ever feel cold in a Renault 4L, and screen demisting is effective. Obviously written for a British family, but not for the Sahara. But anyway, so there's Jim's mum and his stepdad saying farewell to the car, all loaded up for the journey. So on the 1st of August, we set off for Africa. Day one, we replaced the ignition coil. We replaced the distributor gas cap in Portsmouth, not very far from the Isle of Wight. We replaced the fan belt in Chichester, a little bit further. We missed the ferry from Dover to Calais. We had to detour to Brussels to collect the Burundi visas, which, by the way, we didn't ever use. And the car boiled crossing the Pyrenees. And this was the Pyrenees in August. And if you've ever been in Spain in August, you'll know how hot it is. Yeah, we got caught up in the odd parade going through villages and things like that. I think it must have been a public holiday. But there we were with our little GB car. And that was my traveling companion. Really cheerful guy. But let me tell you, he was not interested in people at all. So what this talk is not, it's not about the culture of Africa. It literally was a challenge of getting from A to Z via Nairobi. But mechanically, you could not fault this guy. It was just amazing what he could do. So that I actually lost track with him. He went back to the UK and was doing some vehicles there, but that was pre-digital media, and I've tried to track him, but I can't find him. Yeah. Anyway, that was a sort of typical morning scene, having breakfast, not necessarily in the dockyard, but waiting for the ferry. And of course, there was no satellite navigation or anything like that. The two maps that you see down here on the floor, Michelin maps, were absolutely marvelous. And one could actually get through Africa without GPS. And even to this day, put me on a mountain. Don't ask me to look at a map route. I will find my way just knowing which is north, where the sun is, and where I come from. But yeah, this is basically our route. Crossing here down towards Fez. Down here across the Atlas, we had to do a loop around here. Down here, another detour, and onto Tamanrasset. So that was the first part of it. So in Morocco, we did a little bit of sightseeing. We didn't do it very often, but I loved the old Medina. And certainly it's on my bucket list when I finally retire to go back there and really enjoy Morocco for all that it has to offer. As you see, the Zorki didn't do terribly well, or I didn't at that stage as a photographer with a Russian camera, but I did manage to capture some of the spirit of the old Medina, which I just absolutely loved it. This is the place where they dye the leather. I mean, you hear about, you go to Morocco and you must dye the leather in that. But the sad part of the story is that there's so much lime in the water with the dyes that these guys have a very short lifespan because it actually affects their bones. But nevertheless, that is the leather dyeing works in Fez. So from Fez out into the country, the odd rural scene, and then into the Atlas, into the Atlas Mountains. Still on tarmac, the going was good, really, really beautiful. Every now and then we had to stop to cool off the car, and eventually down the other side of the Atlas and into the real Sahara. So it was another of our cooling points with some local people. Guess which one wasn't the local? Really, really suitably dressed. And there are our water tanks sitting on top with a spare tire and not much else on top at that stage. So having to go, we had to do this little detour here. Here's my mouse. There we go. To El Galia from Timmy Moon, because we needed to change money. We've been in Algeria for 3 days. The only way you could change money was on the black market, and you could only change French francs. Or you could go to the tourist hotel, where they changed travelers' checks for residents only, and only £50. So you had to stay there for the night. We shredded a tire on the gate spike, and the aircon didn't work. And if you look here, you will see what the temperatures are there in August. Yes, it was a challenging night. It was far better to be just out in the Sahara, parked at the side of the road or on the road, foot out, stretches out, and sleep out there. And the silence was just amazing. You could actually hear the blood flowing in your ears. It was such a silence. If you ever get the opportunity, go into the middle of the desert like that, do it. It is just the most amazing experience. Occasionally in the far distance, we'd see the odd light of a Berber tent, or Berber encampment. But literally, we were on our own most of the time. It was absolutely wonderful. Yeah, as you can see, you didn't go too far from the road, but you can see the tracks were very wide. Sometimes the road was up to 5 kilometers wide. So you could choose which bit to go on as long as you didn't get lost on the road, which was quite easy. So from El Galea, we came down into the geographical center of the Sahara in Salah. There it is there. And then on to Tamanrasset in the Yahaga Mountains. Passing by the odd oasis. In Salah was even hotter as the geographical center of the Sahara. And we were there at midday. And the sun was right above us. But this is not my picture. It's one I got off the internet. But we managed to park the car next to a wall so that half the car was covered by the shadow of the wall. And then we sat next to it. And a kind lady just emerged from somewhere with some blocks of ice. Oh, very welcome, very welcome. And then not far from Insula, we got stuck in the river, right in the middle of the Sahara. There'd been a 7-year drought in the Sahel region to the south, and it broke as we arrived. I think what we'd actually done was taken some English weather with us. And wherever you were, if you got stuck, there was not necessarily a lot of hands around to help you, but there was always people to watch. You know, what were these silly Mlungus doing? At that stage, you'll see we also had acquired a much larger tank for our fuel because we thought we would need it going across Sahara as well as through some of the areas in the jungle. So this was trying to get ourselves out of this little river in the Sahara, which we managed to do. We got to Tamanrasset, and what did we find? That's our car in the distance there. We found 1, 2, 3 other Renault 4s, plus some Citroën 2 Chevaux, one of them here in the picture. And those were all French drivers having the utmost faith in their French cars, which they were going to take across the Sahara. What did they do? They all chickened out. They turned around and went back. So we were a bit concerned because we thought, okay, all the rule books that we've read say you've got to go in a convoy. You actually go in a convoy with a big truck, you know, might be a bit difficult. So we went to speak to the powers that be, and they said, have you got water? Yes. Have you got petrol? Yes. Okay, off you go. So off we went. Heading due south, we would have gone straight down to Agadez on the border with Niger, but because of the rains, Lake Chad had doubled twice its size. So you actually had to do a detour by a mining camp called Arlet. So off we went. We were a bit worried about getting stuck, and we found a hitchhiker just as we drove out of Tamanrasset. How I got this photograph, I don't know, because this guy, I think that was the only thing he ever did was lift that spade. He certainly didn't dig. He certainly didn't put the sand ladles out. He did nothing. He ate, yes. He drank, yes. And I had, well, both of us, Jim and I, never ever come as close wanting to just abandon somebody in the middle of the Sahara. But our soft hearts got the better of us. No, that was just unleashing something, so that I think so that we could get the planks out to drive on. No, he wasn't whipping him. And so we headed into the great unknown. The roads just sort of got wider. We did encounter one dust storm, and what you do is if you encounter a dust storm is you put the back of the car to the dust so that you preserve as much as you can of the engine end of the car. The only problem there was that the dust all blew into the little keyhole at the back of the car. And we really had a problem then opening the boot of the car. But eventually we got it clear of all the sand. But while that dust storm was around us, and it was about 2 or 3 hours one afternoon, literally we had to sit there in this 40-degree heat with all the windows closed. It was hot. This again is not my picture, but this is the route now that is used by truckloads of illegal migrants. There we only saw maybe one or two trucks a day, the odd overlander coming north, very little of them in the Sahara. But literally this is where all that migrant nonsense is happening now. And that's one of the migrant trucks. Oops, sorry. What we did come across, and again, this photograph is far too good for my Zorku, but I see I didn't acknowledge the source. I apologize for that. We came across a few of the tourists. They always had tea available. So if you passed the vehicle, you stopped. The little fire came out, the tea was made, and they always had fresh mint. How they had fresh mint, because you know fresh mint only grows in damp areas. I don't know. They must have had secret gardens in the back of their vehicles or something, or on their camels, or whatever it was. But they always had fresh mint and tea. Just a little picture of us going through some of the corrugations. The optimum speed was 18 miles an hour or 29 kilometers an hour. So we didn't do a lot of mileage each day. That was to keep the vehicle going on these corrugations, which were all caused by the trucks. But occasionally you got to areas where there were just sand dunes. And then, of course, the road disappeared because the sand blows around. So what you had to do is you had to walk up the sand dune with the binoculars and look for the next drum. And then you'd head for the next drum and then walk up the sand dune and look for the next drum. So we probably had maybe a day or two of that as well, which also limited the distance that you could travel. But this was typical. Sometimes you were on that hard rutted road. Sometimes you were on fairly firm sand with these rocks around. This is typical of the rocks you get in the Haga Mountains. And sometimes you were trying to get around dunes, certainly not over the top Dakar style. Oops, wrong one again. And this guy, I mean, look at the height of him. He's almost as tall as his camel. And that little bag that's pictured on the right is one of my treasured possessions, which I purchased from him. One of my rare moments when I splashed out and actually bought something to weigh the car down even further, which Jim warned me about every time I was tempted. But then as we got into the Sahel region, this riverbed the previous day had apparently been a raging torrent. And the bank that we had to get up on this side had been undercut by the torrent, and it was about 1 meter high. And this is where we had to use our iron stake and our winch and some manpower. And we managed to get the car through. And this is where my plan comes from, that it's much easier to travel in a car like this than a Land Rover. Because you couldn't have done that with a Land Rover. Not just with a stake. Gradually, and again, this is Dorky quality, there were more bushes around as we got further into the Sahel. Yeah, and sometimes, I'll tell you about those just now. As we got into the Sahel region, you couldn't actually drive off the road or next to it. You had to drive on the road. But the middle monarchy was carved by big trucks. So you can see what happened here. We bellied down. But we actually made a good team, because I would do the driving and Jim would be in the passenger seat. And every time I went down into second gear, you couldn't get into first gear without stopping. He'd bail out and start pushing. So he pushed this car quite a distance across the Sahara. But what happened here was he just bailed out and the car caught fire. Because the petrol had been bouncing in the carburetor and it spilled onto the manifold, which was so hot that it caught fire. He screamed for the fire extinguisher, which was kept in front of the passenger seat. I handed it out to him. While he put the fire out, I grabbed the 50 liters of petrol that we have in these two 25-liter things, which I could normally not even pick up. And I managed to throw them about 10 liters. And that's what adrenaline does to you in those circumstances. We had fairly regular stops to fix punches. Yes, 62 punches altogether, all changed by hand with tire levers. And it was my job to pump the tires up again. Jim managed to get the tires off. And as you can see from this picture, the quality of the mud grip tires. No, I didn't have time to. Yeah, and again, it was that mental state, you know. You're going to get through this, so you do what has to be done. And we regularly jacked up the suspension to try and keep us above the middle monarchies. So that 23 centimeters, which the Renault said it could go, actually jacked up 23 centimeters times about once a week. But it still kept sinking down. This was Arlet, which has now, excuse me, become a biggish town in those terms. It's not my photograph. But we did manage to buy some sugar here. And the only way you could buy sugar was in a block, like this one pictured here on the left. And what you needed, which we fortunately had, was a 5-pound hammer. And you whacked it with all your strength to get a teaspoonful of sugar off there. Needless to say, the sugar lasted us a long time, and we gave up mostly having sugar in our tea. It's easier without it. And so we got further down, south in Niger and into Nigeria. And I remember this scene in particular where we stopped for tea, because it's the first time I smelled goats in 3 years. You know that smell of the bush and goats. And I'd been away from it for 3 years, and I couldn't believe how strongly it struck me in that particular moment. More rivers that we had to negotiate, and obviously here, we were meant to go straight across here, but we couldn't. because of the depth of the water. But this chappie said he would take us around his mealie field for £5, for £3. But if we knocked the mealie plant, it would be, I think, £5. £5 per plant. So we had to drive very carefully through the mealie field, and yes, we did get to the other side of where this river was. So from Niger, we went down to Kano in northern Nigeria, and then we turned east towards Maiduguri to go through to Cameroon. And that is the area where there are so many incursions at the moment that no one can go anywhere near that area. So we were very fortunate to have been able to get through there. So this is us coming down to Kano, across and through Cameroon and into the Central African Republic. There wasn't much option. No, not this. This is the Trans-Africa Highway. It was, and obviously with people coming the other way as well, you chat about the route and they'd say, you know, be careful at this point because there's, you know, you've got to stop here for this guy, then 10 meters further on, you've got to stop for somebody else as well, otherwise you get sent back, 10 miles or whatever it is. There's always local knowledge from both people on the roads and the travelers on the roads. And as I say, these Michelin maps were absolutely marvelous. So sometimes the going was good, and we could make a little bit more mileage. This was in Kano, where we camped at the local agricultural college with some of the students, and two of them helped us find some spare parts and took us into the Medina. For the spare parts, it was £8, but the guiding was free all day. And that's where I bought this absolutely beautiful Hausa Fulani rug, which is, again, one of my treasured possessions. And of course, I got into trouble for that. But you've got to do some things for the soul. There wasn't much tarmac, but where there was tarmac, there were these people drying yams. We actually had to close the windows. The smell of those yams drying was utterly revolting. But apparently that's what the people live on there. And this is just another internet picture of the yams in the market. So consuming yams is obviously quite serious in that part of the world. And so on into Cameroon, which there looks quite hospitable, and there as well, and there. But it was quite hilly. And of course, our car didn't like the hill. So what we had to do is we had to empty the car, take the car up the hill in reverse. Because remember, the little Renault 4 only has 2 forward gears and 1 reverse gear, which is the strongest one. So we'd have to reverse the car up all the hills. And then we'd have to carry all our stuff up, pack the car again, down the next hill, empty it, reverse up the next hill. We had to do that a couple of times. The locals thought we were crazy, which of course we were. But we did at this point, yes. But gradually we got into the slightly muddy areas. And one thing that did impress me here that I feel I must comment on, that even back in the 70s, you didn't see people being carried on these roads on the back of trucks like we did here. They were already using taxis of sorts. So this was the favored, in fact, about the only form of people carrier that we saw. People, goats, furniture carriers. And obviously military vehicles as well. And sometimes the roads weren't quite so good. And sometimes they were a bit worse, but this is like the M1. And sometimes, yeah, we came hurtling down this hill, and suddenly we took off, landed on the bridge, went on a few kilometers, and then stopped for a bit, and then realized that the old blue, the big blue tank had disappeared off the top of the vehicle. So we had to turn around and go back again. And that's what the bridge looked like on the other side. But of course, those planks are placed for trucks and bigger vehicles, not for Renault 4s. But somehow we managed to get up, down them, back up them, found, I think, our big tank because it had been raining. So not too many people were walking along the roads looking for big tanks. Having retrieved it and secured it on the roof, we carried on our way. This is typical of the sort of places we stayed in the CAR. Mostly Murram pits at the side of the road. Murram is that rough stuff that they use to surface dirt roads. And again, that was on Jean Bedel Bokassa, the emperor, self-styled emperor of the CAR. He was still busy ruining it at that stage. We started seeing cattle, and there were always spectators, because now we were in areas where people lived close to the road. And all of these children could speak French. The French were very good colonizers. I had a smattering of French. Jim was pretty fluent in it. So once again, he saved the day with being able to communicate with local people. This was one of the markets in Bangui, capital of the CAR. And I remember buying some meat here. And the guy said to me, fill it. And I said, no, I don't want to buy fillet. You know, fillet is a luxury, especially having come from the UK. No, he says the meat's all the same price, whether you buy fillet or bone or whatever it is, it's all the same price. I said, okay, give me some fillet, which an hour or two later, we were already pretty high, so we put it in the pot as soon as we started camping and stewed it for a few hours and ate it, and it was fine. We hadn't bought much meat anywhere. And gradually we got into the forest areas and into more river areas. This was the Kendi Falls on the Koto River. This is, again, a Google image. When we went past, it looked like that. So literally, there had been a lot of floods. And it was fairly late in the day when we crossed here, and we struggled a bit to find the camping place. But eventually we found a spot not far from the river. And while I prepared a meal, Jim went off to find some firewood, and suddenly he came back and even in the dark, I saw him absolutely ashen. He's busy collecting firewood, and suddenly he hears these footsteps, the crocodile. Yeah, we were back in Africa. It was just another of my pictures of the river. And this was the other side, looking down. And then we had to cross the river into Zaire. Absolutely beautiful river. I think we had to camp there for a night. This was our route through Zaire. We crossed there, came down here to Kisangani, across here, and down towards Rwanda. Because we discovered it again from fellow travelers. We didn't need to go through Burundi, which we got our visas for, because there was now a new road going into Rwanda, for which you didn't need a visa, and we could do that. Just to put it into context, the rumble in the jungle was happening while we were there. We did not see it, but it was happening. And of course, the ferry was always the other side of the river. Always. And what you needed were 2 12-volt batteries or whatever it was. So what you had to do is you had to wait for another vehicle, and you both had to take out your car batteries. You had to put them onto these canoes that you see there. And then, as per the arrow, the ferry is on the other side. And canoes would take the batteries across to start the ferry, and then it would come back to fetch you. And then you had to get yourself onto the ferry. Well, the people who joined us there were a combi load of Belgians who had actually been brought up in Rwanda and in that part of the eastern Zaire, as it was at that stage. And we formed a team with them. Now, this is getting the car onto the ferry. Oops, sorry, wrong way. Oh, we didn't worry about cleaning cars at that stage. No. It was just another picture of it. And as you can see, the front panel here is taking on a bit of shape. And the bumper was still on there. Sorry, wrong way. But what we were warned was you could not take photographs in Zaire. We're told under no circumstances, because of course I've taken my camera out to take these pictures of us getting on and off the ferry. So I said, no, I'm not taking pictures of Zaire. I'm just taking pictures of the car. Oh, that was all right. So as long as I took pictures of the car. But if there were local people around, then I was just a little bit cautious. And there you see our friends, the Belgians, behind us. This is now the Trans-Africa Highway through Zaire. Those are not railway sleepers. They're obviously just shaped logs. And again, there's space for larger vehicles. So whenever we came across one of these, and there were many of them going across the little streams, I would get out and go and walk over them, because I was less likely to go through them than Jim or the car was, if they were rotten. So I was the guinea pig. And then I also had to stand there and say, okay, left hand down a bit, right hand down a bit, to get us across. And then we started encountering a few potholes. They look familiar? Now, that truck had a Greek trader on, and the back was loaded with his wife and children. Very interesting. He then landed up there. So we had to dig him out so that we could pass him where Jim is standing there on the left. And we eventually helped him get out of that hole, and we squeezed past, and he landed up in the hole right in front, and apparently he was still there a week later. But his wives and children did not get out to help him. That's life in Africa. Here we had a couple of locals helping us. So we did quite a bit of road construction in Zaire. And we were fortunate because this was the dry season. It only rained 6 days a week. So this was the Licati mud holes. And this was that more northern part. So here we are, with a bit of tow road and black. It was actually easier to get our car through than it was the combi, because the combi engine is at the back. So the front would just do this all the time. But they got it through. Yeah. And as you see, one about the back bumper is already sitting up at the top. Yeah, as is the back seat. Yeah. It's long gone to meet its maker. And that was taking the front bumper off. And these were pictures taken of those mud holes in 1993. Because I thought, what does this Licati area look like now? And this is what I found. So not much better. You wonder why there's not much progress in Africa. So this was where we actually had quite an interesting thing. And I'll read you this bit from Jim's diary. The going was fair, but after we crossed the Benalia ferry, it was raining heavily. We'd been told at least twice that the Benalia-Kisangani stretch could be terrible when wet. So we pressed on to get as much behind us as possible before the rain soaked in. By dusk, we were wondering whether to pitch camp or not, when a police patrol flagged us down. The officer in charge explained that they were hunting for an ivory poacher who had just escaped with his trophies on a lorry in the direction of Kisangani. Apparently he was a fellow officer. Could we give him a lift and catch the lorry? It would have been a trifle difficult to refuse. So with a large policeman on board and me sitting on the handbrake in between the two seats, we pursued the criminal, skating from side to side of the road like a water boatman, and once spinning right around to face the way we'd come. We overtook the lorry and reached the next police station in time to turn out a few men to stop it and make the arrest. It was by then still raining, so the police rewarded us with a bare room to sleep in and a prisoner for a night watchman. Well, one of the reasons why we didn't really want to camp at the side of the road in the rain, apart from the rain, was that we'd have this big baboon viper across the road in front of us. Yeah. So it was that sort of territory. And what was interesting about that night, and these are not my pictures, but ones I could find, was that there was a huge amount of poaching of elephants going on. When that truck was stopped and they loaded the women and the chickens off the back, the whole of the back of it was full of ivory. You wonder why there are no elephants left in Zaire. And the room that we slept in was about the size of the one that is pictured here. And literally to give us a prisoner as a guard was fine, because there was nowhere that they could go, nowhere that they could get to in those sort of circumstances. But it was the only time we ever lost anything. And we lost one orange plastic mug and one orange alarm clock. So there was obviously a jackdaw around that liked orange things. And then eventually we came across another Greek. He was the road engineer, who just sort of shrugged his shoulders and said, okay, he'd try and help us get through a bit of the road, which he did. He gave us a nice meal. In fact, he gave us a place to stay for the night too. Oh, yeah. And then we continued on our merry way along the Trans-Africa Highway, eventually making our way to Kisangani. And here's another extract. We needed money. Bank A said we couldn't change money until we had a certain form from customs. The police said we should get the form from the immigration department. Immigration officer redirected us to the customs. Customs said no such form was necessary, try Bank B. Bank B couldn't help us because the manager was away, try Bank C. Bank C wouldn't help because we lacked a certain stamp in our passports from the immigration department. Immigration officer had gone out until 12 o'clock, and no, we couldn't wait there for him because parking wasn't allowed. At 2 o'clock, he returned and didn't know anything about any stamp to be put in our passports, but offered us instead one of the original forms that we should have got from customs. But it would need the signature of the chief of police, who was out till 4 o'clock. At 4 o'clock, the chief of police said he'd never seen any such form in his life. Please try the bank again in the morning. At 6 o'clock, the manager of Bank B arrived home unexpectedly. However, he was known to one of our Belgian friends and invited us in, gave us all the beer we could drink, supper, bed, breakfast, and lunch, and changed our money at a good rate. It seemed likely that we were the first foreign tourists ever to be able to change money legally in Kisangani. And what did he feed us in the middle of Zaire? Rhodesia's best prime steaks at the height of sanctions. No questions asked. It was good. Then we were warned that at the Benny mud hole, there were about 50 Mercedes trucks stuck. Now, the Benny mud holes are halfway between Kisangani and the Highlands. In Kisangani, they make the beer and transport it up to the Highlands. In the Highlands, they grow the vegetables like leeks, and then they transport them down to Kisangani. Each trip takes about a week, and they tend to meet in the middle. But in the rule of Africa, you don't give way to anybody. So there's a lot of negotiation goes on. Meanwhile, the trucks sink deeper and deeper into the mud. And eventually, they sort it out, and one gets through, and it stops raining for a bit. It took us 3 days to do 5 kilometers. And one truck would come through, and then another truck would come through, and of course they'd get stuck in these 5 big holes. And you had to either park the car across the road to keep your place, or you had to sit in the road so that nobody tried to get past you. And you'd made tea, and you made more tea, or you watched butterflies. But as you can see, the jungle on either side was impenetrable. So the leeks went rotten, they got tossed out. The beer got drunk, so that had to be peed out. But nobody could go anywhere. So it got a bit unsavory, that mud did. Some of these holes we got through. Some of them we had to be dragged through. And literally, you just hit the road and hope that you kept going. And that little Renault somehow kept going. And so did the combi in some of the parts. And it just went on, and it went on. This was one of the holes. Now, what happens with a big truck? So if it gets stuck, you have to dig down under the diff, jack it up, put logs or bits of bush or whatever underneath the wheels until it can get a grip, and then it tries to get itself out of the hole. Then the next truck comes along and the same thing happens. And eventually you get these huge dongers. I mean, you can see us standing in the donga here. That's just where the trucks have dug themselves down and down and down, further and further, to actually be able to get through. It hasn't improved. This is a 2015 photograph of the same area. And there they are, digging the holes. Yeah. I suppose we were lucky to get through in 5 days. What amused me was one of these overland trucks came through there. And this immaculately dressed young woman climbed out in her high-heeled boots. Where's the bathroom? Oh dear. Oh dear. But interestingly, what I discovered was that those trucks were actually the ones that were used to smuggle arms in for the ANC. If you've ever been to, what's the farm in? Lily's Leaf. They have one of the trucks there. Yeah. And so on into the highland areas near the Burungu Mountains. And we found that the road had been closed because it was impassable. So we had to take the detour by Libero, which was also closed because of landslides. But we thought landslides would be easier to deal with. And they said, well, the road engineer will be very cross and very angry if he finds you there. We thought at least we shouldn't find trucks there. So off we went. But at that stage, the combi was really, really battling with its clutch. It had been battling since we got onto those ferries at the beginning of the CAR. And at this point, their clutch plate died completely. Now, what do you do for a clutch plate in the middle of Zaire for a combi? It's not a French car. So what we had was a couple of pairs of spare Renault brake shoes. So we sat there with the pliers and broke them up, and with a file and filed some of them down to powder. Then we got out the arrow dart, and we put these little pieces onto the old clutch plate, which you see here, and then mixed the powder with the arrow dart in between. And then we put this in the billy can overnight on the fire to bake it, to make sure it would be hard, and it was going to be filed in the morning. We hadn't quite got to that point when the road engineer arrived, and he was very, very friendly. And he said, well, if you go 20 kilometers on to the next village, and then you turn right at the second street, and the third house on the left, you've got a combi clutch plate hanging up on a ceiling there. Was it worth a try? It was. Divine intervention. We had one. So we didn't ever get to try out the concoction, but I'm sure that that remodeled combi clutch plate is still gracing a wall somewhere in Belgium. So here we are doing a bit more road construction on the diversion where the landslides have been. We haven't had to move everything out the way, but just to make sure we got through. And so onto the mountains of the moon. And here Mazorki really didn't like either the altitude or whatever. So it really was not working very well at all. And so we headed towards East Africa, into Rwanda. Now, the road, Rwanda is just hills as well, but it wasn't those gravelly sort of hills. The roads were actually smooth. So we didn't at least have to go up all of the Rwandan hills in reverse. Otherwise, we'd still be going up and down the Nile to try and get to Kenya. So at least you could get a better grip. But I think going by road, you go at least 5 times further than a bird would fly, because it was, you know, like some of those roads in the Transkei, trying to get down to the coast, zigzagging backwards and forwards. But very, very beautiful, lovely, friendly people. Purchased my 2 wooden spoons that still hang in my kitchen today. And at that stage, we were down to eating 3 tomatoes and the last tin of Sainsbury's tinned margarine. Yeah, which we shared with some fellow travelers. This was just before the Belgians left us. These people were traveling north, so we just stopped to make tea and have something to eat and share stories. And then this was looking out for the first time over the plains of East Africa into the Queen Elizabeth Park. That was tar road again on Lake Kivu. It was sensational. As you see, the cars looking a little worse for wear. So what was the story at this stage? We were about to cross into Tanzania. Jim was a resident of the East African Customs Federation, and that's what his passport said. So they said they wanted £100 import duty for the car. We had one brake working. The starter motor wasn't working. We snagged we had 2 brakes working at this stage. The car really only started on a hill. And when she was going, she didn't go all that well. And we actually picked up this Haitian hitchhiker who was talked nonstop about politics, which we weren't quite ready for at this stage of the trip. And this was trying to decide, what do we do? Do we just push the car down the hill into the ravine and walk the rest of the way? Or do we pay the £100 ride? Because we still had to drive all the way back to the nearest bank to draw the money. And eventually Jim did pay it and he did get it back. But I think it took him a long, long time to get that money refunded to him. So this again is from Jim's diary as we went into the Serengeti. The car wouldn't start on the start and for 2 days could only be started with a push or a downhill run. Then the Tanzanian customs demanded £100 import duty payable on the spot in Tanzanian shilling. And once we bought a new solenoid, fitted it, removed it, fitted it, removed it, and finally fitted it again. To us, it was as dumb as the old one. After a full day of mechanicking on the streets of Wanza, the starter still didn't work. We still hadn't found a fan belt the right size. We'd only gained a set of brake shoes, front right wheel. The rear left brake pipe had been punctured on a spike, been clamped with a self-grip wrench, which was lashed and faced to the caution bar. Consequently, we had braking on the 2 right-hand wheels only. The next day, our route plan was through the Serengeti. We figured that if we were to be allowed to go in, the car would have to start on its own at the entrance. Problem was solved with 2 6-strand cables with household flex, each attached, respectively to the battery and the starter motor, and poked into the car through the choke cable hole. Do you remember the days of the choke cables on cars? When Mary touched the ends together, we achieved occasional self-starting, and by good luck, the trick worked on the crucial occasion at the gate of Serengeti. So that was the campsite in Serengeti, and those were our neighbors we saw the next morning. And from Serengeti, it was downhill all the way to Nairobi, where Jim arrived 5 days late for his contract. We'd done exactly 10,000 miles there, and we've had 65 punches. And I picked up 2 hitchhikers, an Australian couple, who joined me after the car had been fixed a bit. This was just some of our travels through Kenya. We headed south into Zaire, and that's all the wildlife we saw there was a blue lizard and 1 ostrich. And then we hit the Indian Ocean at Twiga Beach. From there, Libby and George and I traveled down in sight of Kilimanjaro, down the old hill run, to Mwanza, where my dad had driven trucks for the British Army during the Second World War, as he said, on dirt roads with no headlights at night. The only thing about the hell run was that it was meant to be tar. So hello, potholes. And I believe that's now being repaired by the Chinese. From there, it was down through Zaire with the clutch complaining all the time. Got to Livingston, managed to buy a new clutch plate there. Crossed saw the Victoria Falls on the northern side. This is actually the Victoria Falls from the north, because there'd been a drought there. So that spectacular eastern thing, which every South African had longed to see, but we couldn't do because of sanctions at that stage, we saw without much of a spectacle. And then we crossed on the Kazandula ferry into Botswana, and from there into Rhodesia, as it was at that stage, through Hwangi. And there, now these are not my photographs, because I did not have time to take photographs. I hadn't been able to put the clutch into first gear or reverse for about 2 weeks, which is why I had to buy a new clutch plate. I knew it wouldn't go, it wouldn't last. But in Livingston, when I bought the thing, they said, come back in a week and we'll fit it for you. And I didn't want to wait a week, because I couldn't afford to wait a week. So we went through Hwangi without reverse gear or first gear until there were 2 elephants and musk fighting each other. And then one decided, because there were a couple of cars on the other side, and I found these photographs which really sort of represent what we went through. Eventually, one elephant decided to come our way because it was just us this side. Now, remember, Libby and George were from Australia. They'd only been on the continent a week or 2. And this was their first encounter with wild animals, was this elephant charging down. And it sort of looked something like that. So you can imagine what their faces looked like. One of the other things that I didn't mention was when we were camping at the side of the road, I'd just gone to some huts across there, about 200 meters, to go and ask permission to just camp there. And as I walked back to the car, I saw Libby and George sort of going back and crouching behind the car in absolute fear and terror. And I turned around and I realized that, about 50 people or so were following me from the huts, and every man had a panga with them. And you can imagine, they thought, who was this complete mad woman summoning this angry mob or whatever it was. But I hadn't seen a man without a panga in their hands for weeks and weeks, because that's, just sort of how you traveled in the bush. You needed something to cut things down. So they were probably just going to cut some firewood for us. But anyway, yeah, it was an adventure for them. So Great Zimbabwe, and then we slept under a baobab, and the sand bushman believes it. You will get a touch of madness. So it's an excuse for anything. Eventually got to Maritzburg for Christmas. and to my family, having had to change a drive shaft in Escort. But with the help of some locals at the side of the road, but it wasn't actually the drive shaft that was given up, it was the wheel bearing. So it just clunked its way on to Maritzburg. Eventually, on our way to Cape Town with another friend after Christmas, and it was the only time I ever reacted to food was that day driving down through the Transkei, where there's always cows, children, everything else, not a bush in sight, and I had the most awful gut rot. So, yeah. But we made it to Cape Town. It was exactly 15,000 miles. By this stage, my old donkey had long given up. So no photographs, but you all know what the road looks like. But to actually get to the top of Solari's Pass,